All right. So, what is Thanksgiving?
Thanksgiving is insane. It's this huge, incredible disaster on highways and airports, and it's crowded, and the weather's awful. A meal that takes days, sometimes weeks of preparation, emotional turmoil, fights. But the fact that it's a national holiday that really envelops everyone, it's a sense of the entire country in motion in a way that isn't really like any other day in American life. And the way it's corny, it's cartoonish and kitsch, is kind of a protective layer to sort of not get too direct about it. So underneath all those things, Thanksgiving is about trying to come to terms with this very difficult truth about the United States, that the country is a national project that came about at great expense to Native people. And it's not enough that we're a good country. We kind of have to be the best country, you know. But Native people and African slavery, those two things together, are huge challenges to how you process this. So eventually the country ended up deciding, you know what, we like the story about that meal at Plymouth a long, long time ago, in which these newly arrived people from England in this new country had their brunch in the forest with Indians. And what was that saying? That was saying that we're neighborly. We want this to work out. And we know it didn't all work out, but that's what we aspire to be. That's sort of our best selves.
Did that meal actually happen?
It happened, but nobody really cared. It wasn't like, oh, remember that time last November, let's have those folks over again, fire up the grill. Nobody thought that because it was just a thing that happened. But the Pilgrim folks there, they were writing letters or writing journals. They were like really meticulously detailing what was happening. But even that written account gets lost for basically 200 years and doesn't even emerge until the 1840s when this document is discovered again. And even then it's not a big deal. It's actually in a footnote. And we remember that, we rescue it from being a footnote because that has meaning now. And so by the early 20th century, Indians are an indivisible part of what creates the United States. It's not a chapter that happened and it was bad and we got over it. We're in your head, we're in your pantry, we're in your garage. This imagery, representations, advertising, Thanksgiving says, however imperfectly we remember Indians, we're remembering Indians. And with all the problems with it, it's still a powerful idea, and it's still powerful to not Photoshop Indians out of the national narrative, to say, we're owning this. If there's a way that can open up ways to start thinking about it differently, opens up for people to become activists and try to change things, invent some new kind of Thanksgiving. Let's have the discussion. Let's see where that goes. But before you get to the lessons, I mean, is it right to use that? Is it whatever? I don't know. I guess if I were to put myself in terms of, this a cartoon Indian and all this at Thanksgiving, I'd probably be saying I'm glad to be here. Better than the alternative.
So I am not Paul Chaat Smith. He's coming though. Good evening and welcome to the Whitney. My name is Megan Hoyer and I'm the Director of Public Programs and Public Engagement here. And I'm sorry, I'm a little under the weather, so bear with me. But tonight it is my distinct privilege to introduce Paul Chaat Smith. I'm not actually going to say anything about the video. I'll leave that to him. The occasion for Paul's talk tonight is the exhibition Jimmie Durham at the Center of the World, which is in the final weeks of its run here at the Whitney. It's up through next Sunday, January 28th. I want to thank Anne Elgood, who curated the exhibition, and my colleagues Elizabeth Sussman and Laura Phipps, who co-curated the New York presentation of the show. As a contributor to the exhibition's catalog, as well as someone who has known Jimmie Durham for several decades, Paul seemed like an obvious choice for a public program. So I wrote to him 5 months ago and invited him to come give a talk about Jimmie Durham. I had no idea what I was getting into. Paul Chaat Smith is a writer and a curator. He is a sharp observer of American art, politics, and culture, which he refracts through the lens of American Indian experience. He's the author with Robert Warrior of Like a Hurricane, the Indian Movement from Alcatraz to Wounded Knee. His second book, Everything You Know About Indians Is Wrong, was published in 2009 by the University of Minnesota Press, and it is even more fun to read than the title suggests. And it's for sale in our bookshop. He didn't ask me to say that. Since 2001, Paul has worked at the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C., where he serves as associate curator. He's organized numerous exhibitions, including James Luna's Emendatio for the 2005 Venice Biennale, Fritz Schulder, Indian Not Indian, and Brian Jungen, Strange Comfort. The subject of his talk tonight will be his most recent project, Americans, which opened yesterday. So congratulations, Paul, to you and the whole team. And your co-curator, Cecile Gantome, who I know you wanted us to acknowledge for any bad reviews. Okay. Just in case. But the show actually got a rave in the Washington Post this morning, so you can all follow up. And that's some follow-up reading to do. Americans will be on view through at least 2022, as I understand it. So we have lots of time to see it, although I suspect that after tonight, we'll all want to see it tomorrow. And if you want a sneak peek, search your favorite social media channels for hashtag NDNs everywhere, but maybe wait till after the talk. As I suspect Paul will elaborate, and as you heard a little bit in the video, Americans takes up a contradiction at the heart of the national project of the United States. Even though the vast majority of people have little contact with Indians, they know their lives are shaped by a fundamental truth. The country's existence is inextricably tied to the dispossession of the original inhabitants. The ubiquitous place names and imagery that surround Americans throughout their lives are constant and powerful reminders, and a kind of meditation on that unresolved past that continues to shape our present. With that in mind, I want to acknowledge that we are here tonight on unceded Indigenous lands, specifically the territory of the Lenape. I make this acknowledgement advisedly and inspired by Paul's work optimistically. I hope that this recognition of territory might serve to keep open the questions that artists like Jimmie Durham and critics like Paul Chaat Smith help us to ask about the continuing legacy of settler colonialism in this country. And I also hope it can serve to remind us that this place, Manhattan, from the Lenape word Mannahatta, meaning island of many hills, has always been and continues to be Indigenous space. Please join me in welcoming Paul.
Thank you, Megan, and thanks you guys. Thank you to all of you who've come out here in New York, and those of you tuning in. So this country of ours is preposterous on every level, and I'm here to tell you that we don't appreciate that nearly enough. Since 2001, I've been a curator at America's National Museum, the Smithsonian, and believe me, that place is also appropriately preposterous. Especially my piece of it, the National Museum of the American Indian. Here's a quick recap of the story so far. It begins long ago with a mysterious New York banker who loved big cigars and fast cars, and he especially loved the things that Indians made. George High loved them so much he spent his life and fortune buying as much of them as he could. People say after he left an Indian village, the Indians would be naked because he purchased the very clothes off their backs. He bought so many Indian things that would eventually fill a museum bearing his name in Manhattan. This would become known as the greatest Indian collection in the world. The 20th century was barely half over when George High died. Don't feel bad, everybody dies, and anyway he was 82 and rich and lived large. The New York Museum and the neighborhood around it began a long, slow decline, and suddenly it's 1989, and the greatest Indian collection in all the world is on the auction block. Three contenders emerged. Ross Perot, the excessively colorful billionaire and third-party presidential candidate, who would somehow win 20 million votes, the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and the Smithsonian. It was over quick. Our team said, hey, we're the Smithsonian and you guys are not. Thanks for playing and drive home safe. So this was all taking place in the late 80s and early 90s when Jimmie Durham and I both lived here in New York. We met in Sioux Falls in 1974, working for the Wounded Knee Legal Defense Offense Committee, and we continued to work together as part of the American Indian Movement's International Indian Treaty Council. That was okay for a while, until it wasn't. I know during this time, Jimmie and I talked about this dubious venture of a Smithsonian museum dedicated to American Indians. In his work, quote, I Like the Smithsonian, quote, he includes an expense form the NMAI used back then to shuttle Indians to DC for consulting sessions. We did a lot of consulting back then. He made a piece called On Loan from the National Museum of the American Indian with typically goofy JD personal artifacts. And he had great fun with the name, believing this new enterprise was going to be about one American Indian. I mean, that's what it says, right? It doesn't say National Museum of the American Indians, it says American Indian. So Jimmie volunteered to be that one Indian. With typical modesty, he thought, hey, why not me? And later in the 1990s, when the venue here in New York opened, I wrote essays that riffed negatively about NMAI, saying it could be cool, but probably wouldn't, which in classic DC fashion led to me getting a job there. Would it be a huge surprise back then, 30 years ago, for Jimmie and I to see our different futures, where he becomes a big-time international artist and I become a federal employee? Probably not. When I joined the dark side in August 2001, Jimmie was in exile, first Mexico, then Europe. Our practices and politics are different, often sharply so, yet I'm sure we both agree we influenced each other in deeply significant ways. He doesn't come here anymore. It's doubtful he'll see my new exhibition, and I don't know, that might be for the best. But maybe he'd love it. The dude is unpredictable, that's for sure. There's a famous line about how Americans visit the Smithsonian twice, once on a school trip and later with their own kids. What is special about the Smithsonian museums is that you can stand there and gaze at Lincoln's stovepipe hat or Dorothy's red slippers, with nothing separating you but plexiglass. That is something only a museum with iconic objects can offer, and people still want that experience. In 2001, when we began thinking about this exhibition, we inventoried what NMAI equivalents were to those objects, and we realized pretty quick there weren't any. Now, of course, we have thousands of spectacular works that are popular with visitors. But people want to see a plains headdress. They're not attached to a very particular plains headdress. Iconic objects are about the specific. Lincoln's bedroom slippers, well, they might be interesting and worthy of display, but that's nothing like seeing that stovepipe hat you've heard about your entire life. There's no super famous single Indian object like that. But we soon realized there is an equivalent. A handful of stories Americans know about from an early age, and what we came to call the wallpapering of American life with Indian imagery and place names. So we decided to explore this paradox that most Americans know very little about Indians, and yet from their earliest memories, Indians are part of their lives. And Indians never go away. Of course, these aren't actual Indians, but the idea of Indians manifested in advertising, place names, cars, weapons, and sports teams. The deeper we explored this, the more we found. Eventually, we concluded this is a rocket fuel that could power the entire exhibition. I've written about Indian imagery and Romanticism since the 1990s, and what fascinated me was how the phenomenon was never just one thing, but kind of a shapeshifter. It's always felt reductionist to just label it as stereotypes or racist, because it is so much more than that. So we began seeing the opportunity to surround visitors with Indians they've known all their lives, and these familiar, comforting presences could be a way into a more profound engagement. The goal is to create a situation where visitors feel empowered to assess our arguments, decide for themselves. So we're saying this isn't just kitsch or stereotype or one big racist joke. We're saying that these images have tremendous power, and if you look closer, they can be decoded to reveal deeper meanings. Visitors don't seek information, and if they were, information has never been easier or cheaper to obtain than it is now. What museum visitors want is experience and meaning. They want to learn more about a topic they already know, something that they're interested in. They want to feel affirmed and to feel smart. And most of all, they want to understand how it relates to their lives. This isn't what they say if you ask them, by the way. This is what I know from a couple decades as a curator. And what I really want is for people to have a good time at my show and to be thinking and talking about it 2 days later or the next week. Because if they're not, it's just not worth all the time and expense a major exhibition like this takes. What is singular about this phenomenon that we came to call Indians everywhere is the scope, depth, and duration over centuries of this phenomenon. Of course, there's nothing new about stereotypes or using ethnic groups, imagery to sell things. Sure, there's cowboys and Vikings, go Vikings on Sunday, but there are thousands and thousands of hundreds of Indian-themed mascots in schools across the country, and a phenomenon that goes back a long, long time. So what people will see in the Central Gallery of Americans is how often Indians are used in advertising to add value to products. And people will also see how much effort went into making these images beautiful. This is commercial art at the highest level. Because of culture wars in the 21st century, there's a rush to judgment to say these images are uniformly negative and racist. But when you look at them, they're clearly not. They're adding value to products. They're a positive image. And Indians become, in a way, the ultimate symbol of American authenticity, integrity, and power. This is weird and unsettling because we're now trained to look at these representations a certain way. And when you look at this gallery, it makes clear the Indian situation is so different than the history of, for example, say, representations of African Americans over the past couple centuries. Those popular cultural images are overwhelmingly racist, often viciously so. Indians are portrayed almost always as noble and brave and strong, and by implication, the connection means the product or the country itself is also noble and brave and strong. Yes, the Washington NFL team's name is a dictionary-defined racist slur. It should be changed. The Cleveland Major League Baseball team mascot is obnoxious, stupid, and vile. And frankly, at this point, it is embarrassing Cleveland more than it embarrasses Native Americans. Get rid of them both. But the curatorial team came to believe that the more interesting conversation is about the vast majority of these images and objects and place names, which are not like that. And I think a lot of people will be surprised to learn that the Apache nations are quite pleased to have a helicopter bearing their name. How do I know this? Because the tribal governments and their spiritual leaders offered their blessings as the latest Apache helicopter was, as each new model of the Apaches rolled out. When the South Dakota National Guard received delivery of a Lakota helicopter a few years ago, the political and spiritual leaders of the Oglala Sioux were there under Mount Rushmore, accepting delivery, beaming with pride. Not all Indians agree with this. There are Apaches who are insulted that there's a helicopter named after them, but there are many that think it's fantastic. This is something else that's important for the museum to demonstrate. All Indians don't always agree on everything. So what I became fascinated with this phenomenon is how it's normalized, so we know it's there, but we don't pay attention to it. To me, it's brilliant. The phenomenon hides in plain sight. And I came to believe this ultimately is something positive. To me, it's a refusal to deny that everything about the United States is inextricably linked to American Indians. It's a stand against erasure, a deeply flawed one, full of kitsch and absurd romantic notions, yet far better than pretending the country has nothing to do with Indians. Because I truly believe Americans understand the United States has everything to do with American Indians. Now I want to tell you about the title. Years ago I was reading Daniel Richter's Facing East from Indian Country, and I was intrigued by a passage that said in the centuries before the United States won independence from England, the most common term Europeans used to describe the indigenous was Americans. I had never ever heard that. Then I realized why not? It makes perfect sense. Well, Richter's story checked out. It turns out that the very first definition in the Oxford English Dictionary is indigenous inhabitants of the Americas. They explain how now it's qualified as American Indian, but it needed no such qualifier for a long time. And they had these wonderful citations showing how this was true from the 16th and 17th centuries. For example, the Americans believe that all creatures have souls, or amazing accounts are given of the persevering speed of the Americans. Think about it for a minute. For centuries, when Europeans talked about us, they called us Americans, not Native Americans, not Indians, not First Americans, just Americans. I was also listening heavily to Exile on Main Street back then, and I always loved that title as a perfect description of Indians in the United States. We once lived on the main street of the world, and now we're on the edge of town, across the railroad tracks, past the power stations. How did this happen? How did this become that? This was a framing question we revisited many times in constructing the exhibition. So the title is at once a statement, a question, and a narrative. So with that, Americans became the working title, and we never found a better one. I think my curatorial colleagues will know how often that works out. First idea is often the best. And then, inspired by Spider-Man 3, we decided to follow their example and defy convention and forego the usual long-winded subtitle. We briefly considered one alternative to reach a younger demographic, Americans, : that's right, bitches, no subtitle. One of the most overlooked aspects of the wallpapering of American life with American Indian imagery and names is that it belongs to everyone, more or less equally. Sure, New Age people love Indians, but so do survivalists and Hells Angels. No demographic or political alignment reaches or across so many boundaries. And what we strive to do in the exhibition is to take what people already know and demonstrate how unusual this phenomenon is. So, of course, if I tell you about the weapon systems, the sports teams, place names, sure, I know all that. But what we take great effort to demonstrate is that there really is no equivalent phenomenon anywhere in the world that's cut across so many kinds of boundaries, advertised so many products that have nothing to do with each other, and lasted for centuries. I say, show me what ethnic group has been the face of airlines and insurance companies and brake fluid and whiskey and cigarettes and software, hotels, motorcycles, surface-to-air missiles, software, attack helicopters, bottled water, atomic bomb tests, baking powder, fruit boxes, a third of the states, and street names in every town and city in the country. We argue there's nothing like this anywhere else. It turns out American Indians are the most American thing ever. How crazy is that? So we're building an experience that visitors will see, hopefully for the first time, what has been around them their entire lives, move past the shiny distractions of stereotype and cultural appropriation to see a bigger, a more profound picture. The funny thing about curating at the Smithsonian is that we have a guaranteed audience most museums would kill for. We get about 1 million people a year. But that doesn't always translate into impact, and that's what we're after. Will Americans be in your head 3 days later when you look in your pantry and see your baking powder wearing feathered hats, or hear Peggy Lee singing about Pocahontas in a crowded hotel bar, or when Little Bighorn is referenced in a losing political campaign? I was always inspired by the awesome accomplishment of this phenomenon and the incredible staying power of the handful of stories that people have in their heads. And so, in a sense, we tried to learn from that and emulate it. Indians everywhere is a forever kind of thing. It's not going to go away. And that how we think about it, how we decode it, how we understand it, well, that's always changing too. Indians everywhere is part of the American living room, and the exhibition proposes to rearrange the furniture. Because you know what, it's past due for a makeover. Every museum exhibition is inevitably about the people who made it, what they hope to achieve, and the historical moment of its creation. Whether the show is about Persian rugs or the Persian atomic program, it will always reveal its own history, agendas, limitations, and bias. When we began our earliest discussions back when the decade was young, we still marveled at the election of Barack Hussein Obama to the presidency. How extraordinary and unlikely this was, given 5 years earlier he was an obscure state senator with an absurd and toxic name. Also, he was black. Well, the extraordinary and the unlikely have become routine, and it's now commonplace to remark that the country has not felt so divided since 1861. I don't know about that. I wasn't alive back then, and neither were you. But the fact we can't dismiss that comparison out of hand is frightening. Into this polarized nation enters Americans, which stands resolutely against cynicism and platitudes and easy truths. In some ways, it stands against the present moment itself. Put that way, I guess it sounds foolish. We'll find out soon enough. The show is radical, just not in the ways one might expect. We've worked very hard to build a space that is welcoming and optimistic, and we've been guided by the words of my boss, Kevin Gover, who wrote in our strategic plan that the National Museum of the American Indian believes in the American people and in American institutions. The challenges the NMAI faces are many. In this nation of 320 million, American Indians are about 1% of the population. Most live in urban areas and rarely encounter native people. Americans don't know much about Indians, and much of what they know is, well, not exactly accurate. So for us, the question has always been, where do you start? The problem isn't specific inaccuracies or a lack of information. The problem is most Americans feel they have nothing to do with American Indians. And the big idea to address that problem is this: Americans, we say, are always thinking about American Indians, even when they think they are not. And that evidence, this massive installation, 100 feet by 30 feet, of centuries of representations of Indians in American life. A tomahawk missile, a classic Indian motorcycle. Album covers and T-shirts from Kanye West, Tim McGraw, and Leonard Skinner. Brake fluid and model helicopters named Comanche. Jimmy Hoffa, Elvis Presley, Karlie Kloss, Chaka Khan, Michelle Obama. On a curved screen at the far end of the central gallery, you'll see clips from 67 movies and TV shows. Morticia from the Addams Family might greet you when you enter, or the gang from South Park, or John Ford's Stagecoach, or Seinfeld. What may look like familiar kitsch is revealed as spooky and subversive and deep. Take a close look at the Land O'Lakes butter maiden. She's holding a box of the butter that she illustrates, meaning she goes into infinity, but she's always there. Or the Indian head test pattern beamed into American living rooms for decades. What the hell was that about? We say something profound. Behind and beneath these images and objects are the reason they exist. The show offers a new way of understanding the Trail of Tears, the life of Pocahontas, and the Battle of Little Bighorn. Not as things that happened to Indians, but transformative, titanic forces that reshape national boundaries and national consciousness. In recent months, the word reckoning has been everywhere, referencing furious debates, topics ranging from how to remember the Civil War to institutionalized sexism. I've been thinking about that famous James Baldwin quote about American history being more beautiful and terrible than anything that has ever been written about it. And that maybe we've been hearing what we want to hear instead of what we should. It's a warning, I think. The recent past has revealed that the country's beautiful and terrifying past is present and powerful. And no doubt the past is deeply amused we thought it had gone anywhere. Perhaps it's time to look again at the deepest root of all. And that's what the exhibition ultimately is about. A new examination of the oldest contradiction at the very heart of the American National Project. All that kitsch and naming of sports franchises and streets, perhaps it's a visual mapping of the country, imperfectly and earnestly trying to come to terms with very dark and very hard truths about the United States. Finally, we propose one unexpected outcome might be a sense of possibility around this new frame and new way of seeing. That if all Indians share this connection to American Indians, recognizing that American Indians are at the root of the national project itself, perhaps a new look at our shared past and our confounding present can somehow be a unifying force in a time of division. I know it sounds crazy, but like I said, we're optimists. Thank you for listening.
I have to use the mic. Paul, will you take some questions? He's thinking about it.
6 questions.
We have mics, so if you can raise your hand, one of the mic people can come around.
Hi, Paul. We've met before, and I really, really love your work. We met in Minneapolis a couple years ago.
Can you speak up a little bit? I'm sorry.
Yes, yes. Hi, Paul.
Hi.
I'm Emily. We've met before. We met in Minneapolis many years ago. And I really love your work, and I was completely in and with you until suddenly then it felt like you were very much making a positive case for appropriation. So could you explain a little bit more about that?
A positive case for?
Appropriation.
Appropriation.
Yeah.
Yeah, we really thought a great deal about that, about those terms and about how to characterize things. When we talked about Trail of Tears, for example, which to me is a pretty clear example of ethnic cleansing, we chose not to name it that because we're trying to get out of a particular moment which puts people into particular camps. So we're in this cultural moment in which when we've described the show, people's frame of reference is the discussion over mascots And I think most people in Indian country would agree, and it's kind of tragic, that until Standing Rock happened, in terms of national attention on Indian issues, more was devoted to the NFL team in Washington, which has won like 2 playoff games in 25 years, over their name, versus actual issues in Indian country, right? So my museum, personally, yes, we think that name should be changed. But we wanted to take a larger view of it. And so I would say cultural appropriation, by definition, that's problematic. That's not something, oh, cultural appropriation is great. But what it does is it lets people come to an easy answer. So in a sense, what I wanted to build here is a speed bump that says, okay, you may be the sports fan and you may love this team. You may have been in Campfire Girls and, you know, had an Indian name, all those things. I don't want it to be too easy to just say, okay, that's wrong, I'm sorry, I'll never do it again. I want people to look at the larger notions behind it. I feel like particularly the issue about sports mascots, as I'm a sports fan, I come to it from that angle. Most people who cheer for a team, it has nothing to do with the name of the team. I mean, everybody knows the Philadelphia fans are the most obnoxious. Why didn't they get the terrible mascot, right? But it's like teams don't vote on that. You become a fan because that's your team. And then you have an affection for that. But because it's about your family and your connection, the argument about whether it honors people or not, that's for the owners. That's not really why fans react the way they do. So I feel like it would have been, it's easier for the museum to make exhibitions that are a political statement, a political platform. This is what we believe, this is what's right and wrong. But those things don't move the needle. And we take really seriously our direction from a lot of Indian country that says you reach more non-Indians than any Indian university or newspaper or media. And that's something that we really feel an obligation to talk to our audience as it is. I don't expect everyone to agree with the exhibition. I understand that. I think it's controversial to not make a blanket dismissal of all that. And you know, we'll see how it goes. I do think that for activists on these issues, we're giving them a platform. We're making it a larger argument that in no way negates the specifics of things that should be renamed, practices that should be changed. But we wanted to really focus on, one, it's a crazy, weird phenomenon that really bears examination. It's intimate, it's personal, all of us are connected to it in different ways, and that it's pointing to a larger, deeper truth. So I hope people will be open to hearing the argument, but I understand there'll be differences.
Just as a follow-up, I do hope that it is complicated, and I do hope it is really hard for settler and white people to go into that exhibit. I don't know, I haven't been in there. The example of the Land O'Lakes woman, for example, has been looked at many, many times, and your example here that she goes on into infinity is quite interesting, but as an Indigenous woman, that's not an infinity that an Indigenous woman wants, which is a white person's perspective on how we are and how we look like into infinity. So yes, complication, and I just really hope that it is, it's not easy for, I just hope it's not easy, yeah, I guess.
Yeah, it isn't, I agree with you.
Hi, Paul. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the film that introduced your talk. Tell us what it's about, why you made it.
Well, I'm having serious regret about it. And I don't think it's bad or anything, but the thing is, it's playing in the exhibition like, you know, looping. And the show's going to be up a long time. I want it to be up like 8 months, you know, like King Tut or something, you know, where it's like an event. But it costs so much, and, you know, we can't do exhibits fast. So anyway, every time I'm in that gallery, I'm going to have to hear my voice. And as you can obviously see, I sound nothing like that, right? It's a complete, there was some engineering problem or something. So anyway, it's all about me. This whole talk is all about me. But specifically what happened is we realized this exhibition, we need to be really direct about what we think, what we do. So it's when you present all this. But what is your opinion? What is the museum's or the curatorial team's opinion on this? We tried different things. And in terms of look and feel, we wanted a lot of the show, you can see from those images, are very contemporary, couches to make you feel comfortable, not looking like a history museum, not looking like other NMAI exhibits. And so in terms of this video presentation, we wanted something else that was radically different. And we came across this extraordinary video called I Met the Walrus. And it's this kid who in 1971, I think, in Toronto, tracked down John and Yoko in a hotel room. They were on the run for some reason. They were kind of always on the run. And he just sneaked his way in the hotel, knocked on their door. The kid said, I have a high school newspaper, can I interview you? And John Lennon said, sure. So it's a, 5 or 8 minute recording of that. And the animation was so extraordinary. That was our look and feel guide. Usually you don't end up with that team, but we were able to hire the people behind that. So, we'll see how well it works. But we really wanted to be transparent about what our thoughts are. And we wanted to signal to people coming to the gallery, no flute music, okay? I mean, nothing wrong with flute music, it's fine. No eagle crying. We want a reset that allows people to kind of, okay, this is a different experience and maybe this is interesting. So that's how it ended up. It was pretty late in the project. We just did it in the last 6 months. Did you like it? Okay. Thank you.
Let me ask first, how long has the exhibition been open?
Open yesterday at 10 a.m.
Oh, well then I can't ask my question, but I hope it'll be very interesting to find out how the school trip kids respond to this and whether it's what you expected or something completely different. And it'll be the most interesting thing that'll come out of this, maybe.
It's always, it's incredibly rewarding, but it's incredibly scary to curate the Smithsonian because every kind of person comes to your museum. So whatever I think I'm most expert on, one day somebody will show up who knows more than I do about it, and they'll find that one flaw. And then there are people who, like when I was doing the art exhibitions for children, Brian Youngin, it was really cool to do it in MAI because, as everyone agrees, most people hate art and hate contemporary art the most. But people would come in and they wouldn't go to that show at the Hirshhorn, but they came to the NMAI show. And you have a chance to get a different crowd of folks into it. But what you're saying is right. An exhibition is a really strange thing. If you guys think about how many movies you've been to, I'll bet it's a very small percentage you walked out of. So you sit there for 2 hours and somebody's dictating exactly the sequence, every single thing. They have that level of control. And an exhibition is really different. It's crazy. It's three-dimensional space. I think it really is rocket science. It's really hard. And I'd like to get out of this racket myself, but it's... But the point I'm making is the public teaches you about the exhibit and things that you think are absolutely killer. Maybe it didn't work. Now in this show we did something called formative testing on the concept, so we had a degree of confidence that that was going to work, and we rarely do that. But in terms of actual installations and how people receive it, it'll be really different, and I hope we get a chance to sort of retrofit certain things. And kids are especially interesting to see what they do. We had school groups coming in the first day and for the next couple of weeks. So one thing I would like to mention about that, there's a section called Americans Explained, which is a room you come in. It has the Americans OED definition, and it says, what is this exhibition really about? And it just says very directly what we think, what is Behind Indians Everywhere. And then on 3 video screens, you hear mostly non-Indian Americans talking about what, what they think about this idea of Indians in their life in whatever way. So there's a Smithsonian facilities worker who talks about how much he loves the local NFL team and how it's so important to his family and his community. And he doesn't end by saying, well, now the scales have fallen from my eyes, and I know that's awful. We're giving voice to that. And again, I know that will be controversial. But there's a lot of talk in big museums like ours about civic discourse and conversation. But most of the time, it really isn't. The visitor doesn't really have a chance to respond. So you come in this room, you hear people telling all these crazy stories when they were in the Boy Scouts, all these different things. And then we have these beautiful cards where you write your own reaction to this, to the show, to what people are saying. And we thought we'd have to, force our employees to make them up because you have to have something at opening, right? And we did these cards and visitors told them about the show. And people readily wrote their stories. I think my favorite one so far was from some young person in South Dakota that said he went to a school that had an Indian mascot type name. They changed it, and they changed it to the Nuggets, and then they learned dispossession of the Sioux was partly about the Home State Gold Mine. And it was like, damn it, we tried to fix it, and now there's something else. So we found people receptive and open to that, and if it works, it's because we're not lecturing. We're not trying to shove spinach down their throats. We're not just offering platitudes, but I think people will see it's also a tough exhibition in many ways because it's explicitly referencing all of this exists because of the extraordinary costs paid by Native people for the American National Project. I don't usually give such long answers. I don't know. I'm filibustering or what?
Hi. Earlier you referred to sports teams and some of the negative imagery that has been common for decades. But how do you feel about academia's response to some of these stereotypes? Like there are colleges and universities that may have mascots that don't represent the best imagery, but they're linked to alumni who feel very strongly. Amherst recently changed their mascot for that reason, but I haven't seen a lot of that more broadly. And so what are your thoughts on the unique challenges an academic institution might have around this?
Well, I think that it is actually a reason to be really optimistic because there have been dozens and dozens of public schools, it's happening every month almost, that are engaging the discussion, changing their names. And again, as much as it's really sexy to talk about the pro sports teams, you're really talking about a pretty small number. We're talking about hundreds of public schools teams. Now with universities, that's really interesting. I'm glad you brought it up. So University of Illinois changed their mascot, and yet they still, at least recently, still use Indian type music sometimes. And there was huge pushback from alumni who were so committed. Same at Stanford. Stanford changed their mascot many years ago. And there's a hardcore of alumni that are furious about that. Their connection to that school is bound up in that. So I think it's really interesting when, especially universities, make that choice, and they find it's really hard to not face really negative publicity about it. But again, the big picture is this is really exciting that so many schools are hearing that argument, they're making their decision. And maybe it was meant in good faith and it was never meant to be hurtful, but people are understanding this is nuts. We don't do this with any other group of people, So I'm optimistic about actually how that's moving forward.
Hi. This is probably a follow-up to the appropriation question, and I'm kind of feel like I'm channeling two legal scholars, Angela Riley and Kristen Carpenter, who recently wrote this piece called Owning Red. And it's about the settler colonial logics about making Indigenous culture into forms of property that are then owned by non-Indigenous people. And so I wanted to ask you a question about using all these different kinds of commercial images. Did you have to negotiate ownership or copyright or intellectual property around the images that you're using, or do you kind of say, come back and talk to us later if you have a problem with it?
There are about 300 objects and images in this space, and overwhelmingly, I'm not sure if there's a single one where it's representing a very specific Indian group or nation. And that's one of the things that we explore in Little Bighorn, right? You can take a drawing of a Northern Plains Indian in a headdress on a horse with a Winchester anywhere in the world, and people immediately say that's Indian. This has become the main image for Indians really in the whole hemisphere. And it's an extraordinary thing that one image representing everything else. So in that section, we give great detail to some of the fabulous pieces in our collection. A muslin has never been displayed before, aftermath of Little Bighorn, an incredible headdress, war shield. So we're explaining the deep cultural knowledge of that. And then we're showing how after Little Bighorn, this insane things happen. These are enemy combatants of the state who wiped out 200 soldiers and a very popular Civil War general. And 10 years later, some of the people at that battle Indians become heroes. You know, marching Teddy Roosevelt's parade in 1905, Sitting Bull as a lecture tour. So it's really weird to think about that. And it gets at this relationship between Americans and Indians, which we describe as Americans are fascinated, conflicted, and shaped. When you step back, you know, I'm not saying it's exactly as if, you know, Al-Qaeda became popular after 9/11 or something, but it's really weird. And again, that's why before we could say, oh, that's wrong, let's look at all the things that led to it, because our view is this opens up another way into this discussion that reveals Americans are giving Indians great power in a certain sense by refusing to forget. Just a quick addition to that. I understand your question, but there is a case, as people follow this issue know, Florida State University, in fact, does negotiate and have approval of the Seminole tribe to use their imagery. So there are cases where people have been very supportive. It would be erroneous to say, well, on one hand, on the other hand, because overwhelmingly that isn't what happens. But there are cases where it does. Did we do 6 questions?
We have one more.
4?
Yes, hi.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Just on the subject of non-Native American artists speaking to that subject, what is your idea, or generally what you get, that feeling, besides your own, from others?
Yeah, I mean, there's different kinds of, you know, there's the commercial art and the general usage of it, but we're at the Whitney, so, you know, thinking about other artists, you know, should they be allowed to use specific Indian symbols, motifs, all of those things. Is that what you mean?
No, more in a protest way, you know, going the other direction, not just doing imagery of Native American scenes, working more conceptually in a contemporary way.
But they're not using specific imagery, you're saying, or?
Well, they might, maybe working with the Land of Lakes thing, but turning it in some way.
Right. Right. You know, a lot of these things don't really have clear answers. And what I'm interested in is that the discussion about Indians in the United States, and particularly contemporary life of actual American Indians, becomes a much larger discussion and involves more people, not less. So I'm really interested in non-Indian artists. If we're right in saying this contradiction is at the root of the American National Project, how can non-Indian artists not engage that in some way? So I know some people want to say only Native people should be responsible for this. But I think that limits us. We're saying this is a shared responsibility. We all inherit these contradictions. Did I somehow get a pass that says because I'm half Comanche that I didn't inherit anything from slavery, which built the country? I mean, how does that work? You know, I just feel like we all are part of this larger contradiction, and we all have to find a way in. And I do want African American, Asian American, Latino, white artists to be engaging in these questions. If in some cases it's really inappropriate or unpopular, then we have that discussion. But I think it is really a mistake for people to feel like, oh, well, we now have to do all of that. It would be really not lead to very much good. Thank you.